It was the kind of humid, August night in rural Tennessee where the air itself feels thick with something ancient and unnameable. I was a graduate student in anthropology, working on a project about early American folk burial traditions. That's how I ended up in the old Riverbend Cemetery, a place forgotten even by the locals. They called it Whispering Pines because of the way the wind moved through the tall loblolly pines that encircled the plot. But that night, the air was dead still. My equipment, a tripod, a digital camera with a thermal lens, and a high-sensitivity microphone was set up near the oldest section, where the headstones were just moss-covered lumps of rock, some dating back to the late 1700s. I wasn't looking for ghosts, just for data. But data and history are rarely as clean as you want them to be. I remember checking my watch. It was just past midnight. The moon was a sliver, and the only light came from my headlamp, cutting a narrow beam through the oppressive darkness. My research wasn't supposed to be a ghost hunt, but it was starting to feel like one. The first few hours were uneventful, just the hum of my equipment and the occasional rustle of some unseen night creature in the underbrush. I was cataloging the faint carvings on a slate marker when my camera's thermal display flickered. A hotspot appeared near the base of a crumbling, ornate headstone, shaped like a weeping angel, with its face worn away by centuries of rain. The temperature spike was impossible. There was no source of heat, no animal, no person, nothing. I dismissed it as a glitch, a common issue with older equipment. I marked the spot on my tablet and moved on. The feeling of being watched started then. It was subtle at first, just a prickle on the back of my neck. I'd swing my headlamp around, and for a fraction of a second, the light would catch on something dark at the edge of my vision, a shape that dissolved the moment I focused. The air grew colder, despite the thick humidity. Not just a drop, but a distinct, unnatural chill that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. I pulled my jacket tighter, trying to rationalize it away as a draft. There were no drafts. As the night wore on, the strange occurrences began to escalate. The hotspots on my thermal camera became more frequent, appearing not just as singular points, but as faint, indistinct outlines that would shimmer and fade. They weren't in any particular place. They would appear near one grave, then another, moving through the rows of markers like silent, ethereal phantoms. I started to hear things with my own ears, sounds that my equipment couldn't pick up. Faint whispers, like dry leaves skittering across the grass, but there was no wind. I told myself it was just the forest, the creaks of old trees, the sounds of my own mind playing tricks on me in the isolated dark. Then the dirt shifted. I was kneeling to take a macro photograph of a faded epitaph when the ground next to me seemed to exhale, a low, groaning sound. A small mound of earth, right next to an unmarked depression, rose about an inch and then settled back down. It was slow and deliberate, as if something was pushing from beneath. My heart hammered in my chest. I got to my feet, my headlamp beam shaking. I tried to convince myself it was just burrowing animals, but the movement was too synchronized, too human. I heard another sound then, a scratching, not from the earth, but from the surface of a nearby headstone. I crept closer, and my headlamp beam revealed a fresh scratch mark on the granite, thin and white, as if made by a human fingernail. I shone the light on another stone, and another, and another. Each one had a new, stark white scratch on its surface. It was as if they were all trying to claw their way out. The whispers grew louder, no longer just a faint rustling, but a chorus of indistinct moans and pleas, all seeming to come from the ground beneath my feet. The climax came when I tried to pack up and leave. My field notes were scattered, my hands trembling as I fumbled with my equipment. As I reached for my tripod, I heard a sound from the row of graves directly behind me. It was a wet, heavy sound, like someone dragging a sack of potatoes through mud. I whipped my headlamp around, and my breath hitched in my throat. Standing over a freshly dug, empty grave was the shape from my thermal camera. It was a translucent, shimmering figure, vaguely human, made of heat and distortion, its form wavering in the humid air. It wasn't menacing, not in a traditional sense. It was just there, its heat signature radiating an unnatural coldness. It reached a hand along, indistinct limb down, into the empty pit, and as it did, the groaning from the ground swelled into a single, agonizing scream. Not a human scream, but something deep and guttural and full of despair, as if the earth itself was crying out. The figure didn't turn to look at me, but I felt its attention. It was looking for something. As it pulled its hand back from the grave, a small, dark shape, like a lump of wet clay, was clutched in its shimmering palm. The figure brought the shape to what I assumed was its face, and the whispering, the moaning, and the scratching all ceased in a single, deafening moment of silence. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. The figure's thermal outline intensified for a moment. Then it released the shape back into the grave and turned its shimmering, faceless form toward me. It began to drift forward, a wave of palpable, icy coldness preceding it. I didn't wait to see what it wanted. I scrambled for my bag, leaving my tripod and camera behind, and ran. I ran blindly through the rows of headstones, tripping over roots and graves, not stopping until I burst through the wrought iron gate and onto the dark gravel road. I drove away without looking back. I never went back for my equipment. The memory of that faceless figure and the sounds from the earth itself still haunt me. I've tried to find a rational explanation, but there isn't one. What was that thing looking for? What did it find? The only thing I know for sure is that some graves aren't just for the dead. They're also for the things the dead left behind. Growing up in a small town in Massachusetts, the local graveyard wasn't a place of fear for us. It was a part of life. The old hill burying ground was a historical landmark, a peaceful place with centuries of history etched into its weathered slate headstones. As teenagers, my friends and I would cut through it to get to the convenience store on the other side of town. It was a shortcut, nothing more. We'd sometimes dare each other to touch the oldest stones, the ones from the 1600s, but it was all just bravado. We'd tell ghost stories, of course, but the graveyard itself felt too quiet, too sleepy, to be truly scary. It was a comfortable part of our landscape, a backdrop to our youthful indiscretions. It was only when I was 21, home for the summer after my third year of college, that the graveyard's sleepy veneer began to crack. My job was helping the town's elderly caretaker, Mr. Abernathy, with some landscaping and groundskeeping. My duties were simple: trim hedges, pull weeds, and straighten up the fallen markers. It was a monotonous but peaceful job, and I spent most of my time alone, listening to music and enjoying the solitude. The first strange thing was a recurring sound, a faint, almost imperceptible scratching. It was like a rat scurrying through the underbrush, or a tree branch scraping against a stone. It started on my third day on the job, and I'd hear it just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. I'd turn off my music, and the sound would stop. I'd dismiss it as my imagination, or the sounds of the woods that bordered the cemetery. The second thing was a recurring pattern of displaced objects. I'd be raking leaves near a row of graves, and would find a child's toy, a single faded marble, or a smooth river stone placed carefully on top of a headstone. The strangest one was a small, polished brass key, placed right on the corner of a grave belonging to a woman who had died in 1888. It was the same row where I'd heard the scratching. I picked up the key, confused, but then, feeling a strange chill, I put it back exactly where I found it. The next day, it was gone. The scratching became more distinct. It wasn't the sound of an animal anymore. It was a rhythmic, deliberate sound, like someone tracing lines into stone with a sharp tool. I'd stop what I was doing and try to pinpoint the source, but it would always stop before I could find it. I brought it up to Mr. Abernathy, who just shrugged and said, "It's an old place. Old places make noise." The real dread began to set in a week later. I was working late, trying to finish clearing a section of brush near the back wall of the cemetery, where the oldest and most forgotten graves lay. The sun had set, and the light was fading fast. The air was still and humid, a classic Massachusetts summer evening. That's when I saw the figure. Not a ghost, not a shimmering specter, but a real, solid person, or so I thought. They were standing at the edge of the woods, a man in a dark, old-fashioned suit, his back to me, facing the oldest graves. He was perfectly still, staring at the ground. I felt a surge of unease. Visitors after hours were forbidden. I called out, "Hey, sir, the cemetery's closed." He didn't move. He didn't even turn his head. I felt a prickle of fear. There was something wrong about his stillness, the way he seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. I took a step closer, my voice more hesitant now. "Sir, you need to leave." That's when I heard the scratching again, louder this time, and I realized it was coming from the ground, from the very spot where the man was standing. It was a frantic, continuous sound, like a shovel being scraped against a rock, but muffled by earth. The figure still didn't move, but I watched as his shoulders began to heave in a silent, frantic rhythm. It looked like he was weeping, but there was no sound. Then, as I watched in horror, the earth at his feet began to shift, not slowly, like it had before, but in a frantic, panicked motion. Little clods of dirt and small stones were being pushed up from below. The scratching grew into a frantic, high-pitched scuttling, as if something was trapped and fighting its way out. The man in the suit began to tremble, his entire body convulsing with the silent, desperate effort. The climax arrived in a single, horrifying moment. The man in the suit suddenly and violently fell to his knees, his hands dropping to the disturbed patch of earth. His fingers dug into the soil, as if he were trying to hold something down, to push it back. The earth beneath his hands bulged and then split open, and a single, skeletal hand, its bones the color of old ivory, shot out of the ground. It was an impossibly fast, impossibly thin hand, and it latched onto the man's wrist. The man in the suit cried out, but the sound was choked and thin, like a whisper. He struggled, pulling his arm back, but the skeletal hand was impossibly strong. As he fought, more of the unseen creature beneath the soil began to emerge. First, a section of arm, its skin a stretched, translucent gray, and then the top of a smooth, bald head, like a grotesque, pale skull. The man in the suit was no longer trying to push it back. He was screaming, a silent, terror-filled shriek as the thing began to pull him down into the grave. He was being dragged, foot by foot, into the disturbed earth. I saw his face then, for the first time. It was a gaunt, hollow face, filled with an ancient, unbearable sorrow. And as the skeletal hand pulled him closer, I saw that it was his own hand. He wasn't a man in a suit. He was the reanimated corpse of a man, and he was being reclaimed by whatever he had tried to leave behind. He looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading, and he opened his mouth, not to scream, but to say a single word, "Help." I stood frozen for a few seconds, the sight of his face and that single, desperate word burning into my memory. Then, I turned and ran, not through the graveyard, but back out into the street. I didn't stop until I was home, safe inside my house. I never went back to that job. Mr. Abernathy called me a few times, asking where I'd gone, but I never answered. I couldn't tell him what I saw. I still live in this town, but I haven't set foot in the old hill burying ground since that night. I still sometimes walk past its fence, and I can hear it, that faint, rhythmic scratching sound, like someone patiently trying to claw their way out. I've often wondered what was buried with that man. What was so terrible that he had to try and escape his own grave? But I'm too afraid to ever find out. I've always been drawn to old things, to places where the past feels heavy and tangible. That's what took me to the Boot Hill Cemetery in Tombstone, Arizona. Not the famous one, but a smaller, less-known graveyard on the outskirts of town, where the sun beats down on crumbling sandstone markers and forgotten wooden crosses. I'm a photographer, and my work focuses on documenting these neglected corners of history before they're lost to time and weather. The cemetery was vast, isolated, and silent, except for the wind and the relentless heat. I had permission from the local historical society to be there, and I'd spend my days meticulously cataloging each grave, each faded name and date, my camera clicking quietly in the suffocating heat. The ground was so dry and hard, the graves themselves looked like they had been forgotten for centuries. I felt a sense of reverence for the place, an obligation to the stories buried beneath my feet. The first hint of something being wrong was the feeling of being watched. It wasn't a malicious feeling, more of a quiet, curious presence. I'd turn to look, and there would be nothing but the stark landscape of scrub brush and bleached bone-dry earth. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, a dry hiss as it passed through the sparse weeds. But as the sun went down and the air grew still, the whispers continued. They were indistinct, like a radio tuned between stations, a low, constant murmur of voices just beyond my ability to comprehend. I'd shut off my camera and stand perfectly still, straining to hear, but the moment I focused, they would fade. The third day, I found a stone on a grave that hadn't been there before. It was a smooth, dark piece of obsidian, glinting in the sun, placed on a grave marked with a simple, illegible wooden cross. The grave was old, probably from the 1880s. I took a photo, made a note of it, and moved on. The next day, the stone was on a different grave, this one belonging to a family, a mother and her 2 children, who had died of fever in the late 1870s. It was unnerving. I was the only person with access to this section of the cemetery, and the gates were locked at night. Someone or something was moving that stone. The whispers seemed to grow louder as I worked, a constant, buzzing static just at the edge of my hearing, and I could have sworn I began to hear my name, said in a voice as dry and brittle as the desert floor. I began to work faster. The quiet reverence I'd felt replaced with a growing sense of dread. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the unseen presence. The whispering was now a clear chorus of voices, not in English, but in some language I couldn't place. It sounded like an old, ancient tongue, filled with long, sibilant syllables. I was photographing a row of graves belonging to miners who had died in a cave-in when I saw a shimmering in the air. Not a figure, not a person, but a heat haze that didn't belong. It was right above a grave, a small, unmarked plot with just a single, sharp stone at its head. The air above it rippled, and I swear I could see a faint, ghostly outline of a pickaxe and shovel, as if they were being used by an invisible hand to work the dry soil. The whispering swelled, and it was a cacophony of voices now, all seeming to emanate from the ground itself. The dry earth began to shift, not like something was pushing from beneath, but as if something was being stirred. Fine particles of dust and sand began to rise from the grave, forming a small, swirling vortex in the air above the stone. It was like a miniature dust devil, but it was perfectly contained over that one grave, rotating slowly. It was silent, but the sight of it, this unnatural spiral of dust, filled me with an indescribable terror. The whispering stopped abruptly, a complete and utter silence. The stillness was more chilling than the noise had been. The climax arrived in the form of the whispers returning, but this time they were not indistinct. They were clear, and they were speaking a single, repeated word in the ancient tongue. As the dust vortex swirled faster and faster, I could feel an immense coldness radiating from the ground, the opposite of what you'd expect in the hot desert. The whispers grew in volume, becoming a desperate, frantic chant. The vortex of dust intensified, and from its center, something began to form. Not a body, not a person, but an object. It was a small, ornate silver locket, tarnished and caked in centuries of dust, but distinct. It rose slowly from the swirling dust and hovered in the air above the grave. The whispering stopped, and the air filled with the sounds of weeping. Not human tears, but a dry, rattling sob that seemed to come from the locket itself. As I watched in horrified fascination, the locket opened, and I could just make out a faint, faded photograph inside. A woman's face. The whispers returned, and now they were in English, and they were the most terrifying sound I have ever heard. They were coming from the grave itself, a multitude of voices, all screaming a single, unified plea: "Give it back, give it back, give it back." The locket, its weeping sound now, a high-pitched wail, began to descend, pulled down by some unseen force. The earth around the grave began to crack and heave, and I could hear the faint, hollow sound of 1,000 stones shifting, as if the entire cemetery was stirring to reclaim what had been taken from it. I didn't stay to find out what would happen. I dropped my camera, my tripod, everything, and ran. The sound of the screams and the wordless pleas of "give it back" followed me all the way to my car. I drove away and never returned. I still have the photographs from that day, but I can't bring myself to look at them. Every time I close my eyes, I can see that swirling vortex of dust and the silver locket hovering in the air. I never understood what was so important about that locket. What was taken from that grave that it would cause the dead to scream for its return? But I know one thing. In some places, the dead aren't just buried. They're guarding something,